Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's R Street webinar, Legislative Recap, Lay of the Land on State and Federal Record Sealing. I'm Sarah Anderson, Associate Director of Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute, and I will be your moderator here to lead today's discussion. At R Street, as many of you probably know, we pride ourselves on our pragmatic, evidence-based solutions that support public safety while still upholding individual liberty. Today, in that vein, we're going to be talking about clean slate policies, which automatically seal eligible nonviolent criminal records after a period of rehabilitation. These laws are not about erasing the past. They're simply about removing outdated barriers that hinder policing, clog our courts, and complicate reentry into society long after someone has served their sentence. Today's panel features three of R Street's government affairs experts who will help us unpack what has happened with clean slate bills in state legislatures that have concluded for the session, where things stand for those that remain in session year-round, and some of the prospects for effective clean slate policy in Congress. So without further ado, joining me today, we first have Mark Hayden. Mark is our Senior Director of our State Government Affairs team. Prior to joining R Street, Mark served as a senior manager for a criminal justice reform organization. Before that, he was a campaign field representative with the National Rifle Association and a campaign manager for a Republican congressional race in Western North Carolina. He also served as legislative liaison and public affairs specialist with the state of Georgia, as well as legislative aide to the Georgia Senate President pro tempore. In this role, he'll speak to some broader trends we have seen in state legislatures this year and how those trends are affecting the ability of legislatures to pass criminal justice-related measures, including clean slate. Next up, also from our state government affairs team, we have Robert Melvin, who is our Director of Government Affairs for the Northeast region. Prior to his time at the R Street Institute, Robert worked for over a decade in advocacy in both government affairs and grassroots for various trade associations, and also worked in the Virginia General Assembly. As someone on the ground in a couple of states that we are actively supporting clean slate campaigns in, Robert will give us an insider's look into some of the discussions of what works and what doesn't work in building bipartisan support for automated criminal record sealing. Finally, we have Anthony Lamarena, who is our Senior Manager of Federal Government Affairs. Before joining the R Street team, Anthony worked in state and local government at the Hawaii State Legislature and the government of Guam. He then joined a DC-based startup tech company, helping grow market share and scale the evolving company. Anthony will take us through the current landscape of policymaking broadly at the federal level, and then help us zero in on what's really needed to chart a successful path forward for clean slate in Congress. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining. And by way of housekeeping for our audience, who, of course, thank you for joining as well, just a few things. We will have time at the end of the webinar for audience questions, so please feel free to drop those in the chat as we go. I will also be adding some of our R Street resources relating to Clean Slate into the chat as well throughout the discussion, so be on the lookout for those. And with that, let's dive in. I want to start with a little more digging into our panelists' backgrounds and their roles at R Street. Many in our audience today have probably seen work from the scholars on our criminal justice team, which I'm a part of, but a really critical part of R Street is the work that we do to translate the policy work of our fellows and researchers into pragmatic policymaking. So to set the stage for all three of the panelists here, can you each describe in your own words the role that your respective teams play in helping our policy teams at R Street influence policymaking, and what, in your view, is the most important thing to keep in mind when working to do this on criminal justice issues broadly? Mark, I'll start with you.
Well, as senior director of the state government affairs team, I manage a group of government affairs professionals that are embedded in different state capitals across the country, and some of us are also syndicated newspaper columnists. And what we primarily do, our central job is to educate lawmakers on R Street's positions, on our policies, and push back against some of the more pernicious pieces of legislation that are invariably introduced in legislatures across the country every single year. And promoting good criminal justice policy is one of the central planks of what we do. And it's critically important. In one way or another, criminal justice is related to nearly every aspect of life and society. So a fine-tuned justice system can be transformative on a macro level. And it's critical that policymakers keep this in mind. And in part, my team's here to ensure that they do.
Hey, Robert, do you want to piggyback off of that as
Yeah, I'd
fellow
love to.
state affairs guy?
Yeah, so on the state government affairs team, I'd say that we really help effectuate a lot of the research that our policy teams do at our street into state legislation and laws, and we also, as Mark alluded to, we use that to help influence the legislative process, and this is especially true for our CJ policy, where we've had a lot of engagement, especially in my region. I look at states like Rhode Island, Maryland, et cetera, where we've done an incredible job of engaging with lawmakers in those places. And I find that it's also very beneficial when we try to get our policy experts involved in those interactions, because they are the experts who really know the nuts and bolts of these issues, whereas I view myself almost more as a facilitator of those interactions and trying to ensure um, that we're getting our policy teams in front of the right people. And so we've seen it pay a lot of dividends, especially when we look at places like Maryland. I mean, thanks in large part to our efforts, we were able to get the clean slate, get a sponsor for a clean slate bill in Maryland just through these outreach efforts, and that's why Senator McKay decided he wanted to go and carry the legislation, was just because of our initial outreach. And when we've spoken to some of the other lawmakers and speaking to all of them, we found that there's typically broad bipartisan support. And I feel like that's because you really should sit down and talk to everyone. And the more folks you speak to, the more likely you are to have a benefit, a positive impact in the policymaking process, because you never know what minor details folks might agree with you on and which ones they might not. And so there's always someone that's a yes until they're a no, in my opinion.
Anthony?
Awesome. Yeah, and I echo a lot of what my, colleagues on our state government affairs team have just said. I just do a lot of it on the federal level. And I view a lot of the work that me and my colleagues on the federal government affairs team do is, obviously our scholars at our street definitely are, I would say, policy experts, as Sarah touched on before this, but a lot of times they're not exactly political experts. And I feel like that's where, we come into play and where we become an asset. I think a lot of experts tend to be siloed, in the specific issues, that they work on. And, we are able to kind of understand what the broader landscape is and see how that policy can fit with what's going on a more national level. And so, sometimes it really is meeting the moment is what I like to call it. And, with some of the issues that we work on, especially in the public space safety space, sometimes that comes at times where it's not exactly, positive news coming out, and being able to speak with the right tone to ensure that we're not trying to, take advantage of a specific moment or a tragedy, but rather educate lawmakers and their staff on how our research can help benefit, future policies in the future. And so, that's what I see a lot of my work doing. And, working with lawmakers on Capitol Hill and their staff to not just, speak to them about our priorities at our street, but also listen. That's one of, I think, the top components of my job is being able to listen to the priorities of members of Congress and why they, ran for office and got elected, and to speak to those concerns and, see how our priorities at our street can fit with, what they're trying to effectuate in Congress. And so those are, how I view my role on as a federal, on the federal government affairs team and working with our criminal justice team to, push responsible public safety initiatives. And, I've said this many times, a lot of times policy experts, view things more on a macro level, but I think a lot of times I like to talk about things from a macaroni and cheese type of level because, that's an actual digestible way for folks to understand, very nuanced policy, and really absorb it and see how it, goes into what their daily lives look like. And so, that's my job to be able to communicate that down or up to whoever and, get things done. And so I'm really proud of the work that we've done on, federal government affairs team and look forward to chatting more about that here in this webinar.
Yeah, well, thanks to all three of you. I think I speak for all of the policy teams at R Street when I say we would be certainly lost without both our state and our federal government affairs teams in terms of effectively translating our policy research into actual policies that affect everyday lives of Americans. And Anthony, something you said that I want to draw out a bit is how you talk about, especially with criminal justice issues, there's a lot of emotion involved, there's a lot of sensitivities involved, and it does affect people's safety. And so we have to be kind of cognizant when we're talking about that. But something that I like to say when I'm talking to folks is if there's something horrible that has happened in your community, it could be a downstream effect of an ineffective policy. And so we should be looking, in fact, at reforms to the system that can help address and prevent those types of tragedies from occurring. Because if something's not working, it means something may need to be fixed. And so I think from your perspective, Anthony, exactly what you're talking about in terms of how we frame these issues and how we talk about them with public safety at the top of the list when we're talking about criminal justice is really important. So thank you for sharing that. For all three of you, next, I just want to talk about the criminal justice landscape broadly and how receptive you all feel that legislators are to improving efficiencies within the criminal justice system. I think these days we are in an era of DOGE at the federal level and people talking a lot about what the government is or is not doing, what the government should or should not be doing. I think that the government should be keeping people safe, particularly as it comes to our criminal justice system. So do you guys feel legislators are receptive to criminal justice policy changes? They are not receptive to criminal justice policy changes, and how might you frame it in a way that people can come to the table constructively?
Yeah, so I'll jump right in if that's all right. So from my observation, there's almost every lawmaker has something that they are interested in improving with regards to efficiencies with respect to the criminal justice system. Now, really, each individual lawmaker has a different sub issue or issue that they're interested in trying to address, but almost everyone wants to try and make it better. And I would say that's kind of just a general thing that we see with lawmakers in general is that they're always trying to make improvements to all public policy. Whether or not it's a good improvement or it's a bad improvement is a different thing. Uh, but I think especially in Maryland, there were lawmakers when we've done our engagement up there that have shared with us, okay, so I appreciate what you're talking to me about clean slate on. It's something I'm supportive of, but there's this other issue that I really want to like make some ground on. For example, there was this one Republican delegate we spoke to that shared that he wanted to work on trying to reform the arrest quota system, and so he pulled us in on that, and we got really involved with it. We were one of his major. And we served on his presenting panel when the bill was heard in committee, and we were uh, played a large role in trying to help with that effort. And then I think of some other ones, things like the Second Look Act, which was passed in Maryland this recent General Assembly session. And there was one particular GOP state senator, that we had spoken to previously, who had shared he was interested in trying to go and make some reforms like what are like those found in clean state. I mean, excuse me, second look legislation, but he had some concerns about going too far, things like certain felonies and things of that sort being considered. And so, we helped, I would say, educate him on really a lot of those intricacies related to it. And, especially the perspective I think that we brought to the table, because we were one of the ones that spoke specifically on a lot of these topics. We typically talk about, you mentioned, Sarah, the inefficiencies. Well, how can we make it more efficient? How can we save taxpayer dollars? We tend to highlight that at least a lot in the testimony when I'm involved. And I think that provides a really unique perspective because everyone is always talking about all these other issues that pertain to it, whereas we're saying, well, this is costing taxpayers a lot of money because it's an inefficient system, and here's how we can make it better. And I think that really resonates. That's why we were selected to be one of the final panelists to testify on that second second look bill in Maryland. And, I think that that's true also of the clean slate issue, is that, we almost every lawmaker wants to try and do something to improve the situation. I mean, and I see that with a lot of the Republicans that we've engaged with, as well as the Democrats. I mean, everyone is kind of all about improvements, but one of the things that I think kind of can hold it back sometimes is some of those external factors that we can't control. It's like, well, broad support for something, but it might be like a budgetary thing that holds back a policy because of the cost with implementation, upfront costs, even though the long-term savings are, going to be very good for the state. So.
Sure,
To kind
well,
of second some of that, I'm sorry, Sarah. Yeah, I think it depends on the lawmaker. So some are certainly passionate and still very passionate about criminal justice reform, while others, their passion lies somewhere else. It might be energy reform, it might be property and casualty insurance reform, which is perfectly fine, and those are very important. But even so, I'm in the South, I'm in Georgia, and there's still plenty of appetite to improve government. And to speak to an anecdote, I had a recent conversation with a judiciary chairman in Georgia, and we talked about the justice system, and he remains very passionate about reform. But when people think about Georgia and justice reform, I think we think of the Nathan Deal years where we were having these big, bold, landmark bills passing and grabbing headlines. Well, it's easy for people to say, well, criminal justice reform is dead in Georgia, and we'd push back against that. This judiciary chairman I talked to, he was emphatic in pointing out that the General Assembly continues to enact bills to reorient the justice system for the better. They may not grab headlines like they did, but they're still moving in the right direction. And for that, I think taxpayers should be pleased.
Yeah, and I
yeah.
would say similarly on the federal level, I think people are receptive if when you speak to the issues that they care about most. And I think, sometimes you have to realize that framing it as a criminal justice issue will not make someone, want to prioritize it, because that's not what they view that they were sent to Washington to do, right? A lot of times you'll hear members say, I go back to my district and people ask me, I can't afford groceries, the economy is really bad, I can't find a job. And that's what they view, they were sent to Washington to do. And, being able to speak to those issues, though, while still talking about our priorities is key. And so, a lot of times, for example, like the economic message I just sent, framing this issue as an economic one, 60% of folks that, re-enter society after being incarcerated are unemployed for the first year, upon reentry, 27% are unemployed after that first year, and so, and then once a lot of them find work, 40% earn less than their counterparts that, don't have a criminal record. And so a lot of these issues, can translate down, when you're talking to members who may be a little bit more socially conservative. This is a family's issue. Half of the kids in this country have at least one parent that has a criminal record, and that parent then can't, help do certain things, go to kids' graduations. If they're making 40% less, then that family's getting less money, and that, that's less opportunity for that child to be successful in life and to send them further back. And so being able to speak to those types of, priorities that members have, and, kind of their language, I like to say from time to time, is always key. And I think when you frame it, on what makes sense to them, a lot of times I would say that they're quite receptive. And so, whether it be those types of arguments, the public safety argument that Sarah mentioned earlier, I think these are, how, our advocacy has been effective to not just speak to, how we talk about this issue, but rather how, members can kind of grasp it, and why it should be important to them.
Yeah, well, thank you all for those comments and anecdotes. I think are especially impactful. And Robert, something you said that I think is worth re-emphasizing is, and Anthony, this is something you talk about with our team a lot as well, is when you go into a meeting, you might intend to be there to talk about police accountability, and then the staffer or the member starts talking about, well, while we're talking about, criminal justice, I had a guy in my district who, came to my office, wasn't able to get a job, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up hiring him or this or that or whatever it may be. And then you're like, oh, well, we're here to talk about police accountability. And obviously we're still going to talk about that, but it opens a lot of doors to talk about additional issues that kind of pop to the center of somebody's mind when they think about something related to what we're talking about. And so, Anthony, I think you brought that up as well in terms of how important it is in advocacy with legislators to listen to what they are interested in and figure out where we can supplement that. Because a lot of times, I think, especially with regards to clean slate and other reentry sort of oriented policies, that can be some of the most understandable part of the criminal justice system to a lot of legislators, just because they understand that, we do have 95% of folks who are incarcerated coming back into society. And if they're not being productive members of society, that's probably not something that we want, right? And so I think that type of messaging can be a good entry point into the criminal justice issue for a lot of people. So I really appreciate all of your comments there. I do want to turn now to some of the on the ground work that we have done and that other partners have done on Clean Slate this year and in the past, and kind of where things stand at the federal and state levels. So we know that in recent years, a lot of states now have embarked down the path of making clean slate policies a reality. This started with Pennsylvania in 2018. And since then, states, red, blue, purple, all of them have adopted similar policies. I think we're at 12 now, including Utah and New Jersey in 2019, Connecticut and Michigan in 2020, Delaware and Virginia in 2021, Oklahoma and Colorado in 2022, Minnesota in 2023, and a couple of others. So thinking about that list of states, certainly you have pretty much all different types of blue states, purple states, red states, rural states, more urban states, which just speaks to kind of the efficacy of this type of policy across all types of demographics in all states. But this year, as many state legislative sessions have wrapped up or are currently wrapping up, and Congress has finally emerged from its months of debate over reconciliation, Anthony, I'm sure you're breathing a sigh of relief on that one. It's worth taking a look back today at what advocates for smart record sealing policy have accomplished across the nation in state legislatures and at the federal level. In my view, despite just divisive media rhetoric and some complicated political dynamics, there is still room for bipartisanship around common sense criminal justice policy. And Clean Slate can and should be gaining momentum. But of course, as with any policy proposal, there are many, many challenges to passage in a lot of different places. So Anthony, at the federal level, you and I have talked about this a number of times. Clean Slate has been introduced every Congress since 2018 when Representative Blunt Rochester, now Senator Blunt Rochester from Delaware, introduced it, the first version of that bill. But moving the legislation further through the legislative process has been somewhat tough. Can you walk us through the history of where the federal Clean Slate bill came from and what the current landscape is like in Congress for its passage and any roadblocks it might face or how we can address those?
Yeah, I think the federal bill for Clean Slate has had different iterations throughout, its first introduction in 2018. I think, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's now moved on to be a senator, has really been able to work effectively with Republicans to kind of meet them where they are as well, bringing the bill a little bit more to the middle, having certain carve-outs to ensure safety in some areas, working with other stakeholders in the law enforcement space to ensure, some of the definitions of the bill are properly fleshed out so that, folks in law enforcement are okay with the language has been key. And so, I think the tough part with and what makes the federal bill very important is unlike, a lot of states throughout the country, even ones, before they've passed clean slate laws, they still had some sort of petition-based expungement programs. The federal government doesn't have that. And so folks, with wrong convictions, even if you were just arrested and, never were charged of a crime, all of those remain on your record, and there's no way for you to have them essentially sealed. And so, we view that as kind of a huge inefficiency of government. And, a lot of folks think, well, the president can pardon whoever they want, and all this types of stuff. But pardons don't necessitate your record still being sealed. Like you'll folks will still be able to find that, whether you're trying to apply for housing, a job and educational opportunities. And so that's why I think a lot of us view the federal bill as being so essential and also in good shape to ensure, safety while also, promoting reform. Um, I think a lot what is needed, is continued education. What we've been seeing throughout as Congress, for since 2018 is there's more and more new members of Congress that get elected each year. And you're seeing a lot of members that have been here for a while, especially in the last cycle, retire. And so it really then, becomes an opportunity, I view it, but sometimes a hill to climb with education, having members who have never been exposed to this issue before, been exposed to this, and why this reform is necessary, and educating those staff and those members will be key for its, eventual passage. I think what's tough on the federal level continues to be there just isn't enough political oxygen in the room. Unlike my colleagues on the state government affairs team, state legislators pass, many, many bills in one year. The federal government doesn't exactly do the same unless, they're naming post offices or other federal buildings, if you count those as proper bills or laws. But I think that's been one of the major challenges that we've faced. Obviously, Sarah just mentioned on the federal level, we've had to contend with reconciliation, which I'm sure a lot of folks have heard many, many a time. Now the Congress is getting ready to go into its appropriation season with government funding expected to run out at the end of September. They're also working on the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual bill that they always have to pass. And so there's multiple different things that will continue to suck the time in Congress. But, I think, as I said earlier, it's a lot of it's meeting the moment. I think getting small wins where we can is essential, obviously, with our main goal in mind as being, the federal clean slate bill. But, a small win, for example, that was in the budget reconciliation bill for folks reentering. I'm sure a lot of people have heard about work requirements for certain government programs like Medicaid. And, as I said, with that statistic, 60% of, folks that reenter in their first year are unemployed. And so, there was a small carve out that was included in the language of the bill, now law, that would allow for up to 3 months of essentially folks who are reentering your first 3 months, you would not have to, fall under that work requirement. And so, we found that to be a common sense reform and worked with Republicans on it to, ensure that it was kept in the bill. And, thankfully it was. And so, getting small wins where we can is something that we try, especially with, the different vehicles that we are left to work with on the federal level. A lot of it has to be, find that in, as I said, and speaking to whether it be a defense issue, a budget issue, a farm issue. And a lot of them have a good amount of overlap, but a lot of it's just finding, those opportunities and being able to educate and then also effectively advocate as well.
Well, thank you. And we talked mostly about the Clean Slate Act itself, but there are two other federal bills that we follow as well and support in Congress that relate to Clean Slate or kind of put processes in place and additional steps toward Clean Slate. And that's the Fresh Start Act and the Kenneth B. Thompson Begin Again Act. Can you describe a bit about those and kind of how they differ from Clean Slate and why they might be, have an opportunity where Clean Slate may not, or kind of vice versa?
Yeah, I would say the Kenneth P. Thompson Begin Again Act is a great kind of first start. It really is one of, kind of more of I always like to call them sometimes like housekeeping related reforms where it's really just changing definitions a bit, which, will be great to expand more folks' eligibility in this specific space. I think what most folks are more engaged on a lot, as Sarah mentioned, with 12 states around the country that have passed clean slate. And as Robert mentioned earlier, some of the barriers to clean slate in the states tends to be budgetary or other reforms as well. And so the Fresh Start Act allows for an existing program to be utilized for grants to to states to implement a lot of their clean slate laws. As we'll probably all say many a time, different states are in different places when it comes to their clean slate journey. And no matter the size of the state, I remember Robert and I and Sarah being in Rhode Island and, realizing just because it may be the smallest state in the country, and with only 3 counties, they have, I don't know, probably 50 to 70 different townships that then all have different record keeping and recorders, and some may not have gone digital yet. And so, the Fresh Start Act allows and gives the proper resources to a lot of the states that need it to implement these laws. Is, obviously automation isn't something that comes to, governments naturally. And so, obviously it takes time and a lot of time, and especially it takes resources.
Yeah, that's a great segue into turning to the state level. Robert, I know the resource question has been a large topic in a lot of state legislatures. You and I have talked about how a lot of the COVID era funding, whether it's from CARES Act or ARPA or the opioid settlement funds, all these different types of federal funds that came down to the states since 2020 have kind of been drying up or expiring this fiscal year, which has put a lot of states in sort of a more or less stressful situation relating to their budgets, because, at the unlike the reconciliation bill at the federal level, we cannot borrow money at the state level. And so states every year do have to balance their budgets, and these kind of large deficits that the federal government runs are not a possibility at the state level. So a lot of state legislators are contending with, where do we cut? Where do we pare back? Can we cut? What improvements can we make to save money? And so, Robert, multiple states in your northeastern region have already passed clean slate, including, like I mentioned, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia. And as I mentioned, Pennsylvania is not in your region, but it is nearby. And it was, in fact, the first state to pass clean slate. So the northeastern region and its neighbors are well along the track of adopting these policies. And you've mentioned Maryland a couple of times now, very deeply involved with bringing automated record sealing and expungement to Maryland. Just walk us through kind of what happened this past legislative session in Maryland, and what dynamics were at play, I guess, obviously including the budgetary question that affected Clean Slate's ability to become law, and then maybe talk a little bit about the bill that did become law, the Expungement Reform Act, that I did share the testimony that we did on that one in the chat as well for the audience to peruse. But similar to kind of the Kenneth B. Thompson bill and the Fresh Start Act, the Expungement Reform Act is not a clean slate bill, but it is in the same vein that helps improve the expungement process. So please just talk to us about Maryland and where you see the opportunities for that bill going forward into the next legislative session. You are on mute.
Sure. So we've been involved in Maryland for a couple of sessions now with regards to record sealing and clean slate. And so one of the things that, and in fact, it was that initial effort that really, those initial efforts that helped secure some broad bipartisan support for it, specifically in the General Assembly. And this led to a Senate bill sponsor who decided to carry the legislation just because of our outreach. One of the things, though, that we've kind of observed over the past couple of years, just from those interactions, and there's the support for the effort has not gone away. Folks are still strongly in supportive of clean slate policy. The thing is, though, is that I'd say since we started this effort several years ago, there have been budgetary issues that have kind of bubbled up over the years that have put the squeeze on a lot of new bills being enacted in Maryland. And so that's been one of the primary barriers, has been the fact that that it's those fiscal challenges that are really holding us back in the state. And as a result, this means that any bill that has a cost associated with it was really put on hold, including those that even had significant support, like Clean Slate. Thankfully, though, through working with our coalition that we're involved in Maryland, there was the Abhishek reform that we got through, and so for those of y'all who are unaware, Maryland had this unique situation where if you had previously engaged in some sort of illicit behavior, and let's say you got caught for cannabis possession. Well, then if you, as a result, when you were on and you were placed on probation, if you anytime during probation you went and there was a technical violation involved, like you forgot to alert your probation officer that you changed your address, or something super insignificant or minor, that would cause the state to go and find you as being not successfully completing your probation, and the terms of everything. And so as a result, you had a lot of folks that were getting held back by that case law, the Avishek case law, because this individual, he found, Avishek, he went and unfortunately had a technical violation. Then he tried to get an expungement done several years later, was denied because he didn't successfully complete his probation. And so the law that we were very supportive of, that I believe it was a governor's bill that got passed and signed into law a couple months ago, went and addressed that issue. And the thing that was most problematic about it was the fact that you would have people that technically, if they would have been, thrown into jail for even a more serious violation, served their term of their jail term, and then gotten out, they were able to qualify for expungement over someone that had just simply had a technical violation while on probation. It created this like different class system almost, if you will, with regards to the criminal justice system. I think that part of bringing it back to clean slate, I think part of our long-term strategy that we're going to need to really focus on, because the budgetary issues remain an ongoing issue, and the fiscal note was, it just kept talking about, the costs, but there wasn't a whole lot of mention about the fiscal benefits, things like how it can help pay for itself over time, because those that are affected are less likely to engage in working off the books. Then they're tax-paying citizens. They're contributing to the tax base, and not only that, but it helps reduce your recidivism. Then you don't have these people going back in, and the court costs associated with all that, and those other costs in the system, because we're helping to seal their records so they can become contributing members of society again, because currently a lot of them are precluded from doing so because of how just the law is structured.
Now I'm the offender there, Robert. Now I was on mute. So I joined you there. Thank you for bringing up the economic case. I'm going to put a pin in that conversation real quick while we turn to Mark, but then I want to go back to Anthony, because he and his colleague on the federal government affairs team, Nick Thielman, actually wrote a piece recently on exactly that, the economic case for clean slate policy. Because Robert, like you said, sometimes these fiscal notes indicate that clean slate does have an upfront cost, which is certainly true, but the long-term fiscal and economic benefits far, far outweigh that initial cost. And so Anthony and Nick wrote a great piece about that I'd love for him to talk about here in a minute. But before we go back to Anthony, Mark, I want to talk to you. You work primarily in the southern region of the state, where there are a lot more deep red states. The most recent state in your region that passed clean slate was Oklahoma, which is certainly one of those deep red states. They passed the law in 2022. Can you share some of the political dynamics of a deep red state like Oklahoma, or others in your region that have kind of a similar legislative breakdown by party, and why you think clean slate found so much success in Oklahoma? Are there opportunities for other deep red states to embrace it, and kind of what was the messaging there that was able to help it get across the finish line?
Well, all great ideas are automatically passed into law, obviously. I'd like to tell you that that's the truth, but it's simply not the case. I mean, some bills, they go through fairly easily, at least from the outside, it looks that way. But others, it's not the case. And some criminal justice reform bills are challenging for everyone working on it. But when it comes to Oklahoma, this is a neat case study, because they had four indispensable elements that really greases the skids when ensuring or working toward getting a bill across the finish line. They had a policy need, they had public support for addressing it, they had political will, and they had political muscle. So the public policy need was that Oklahoma had unfortunately long-standing criminal justice reform problems. They have one of the highest incarceration rates per capita in the country. 1 in 4 Oklahomans has a criminal record. So there was a need there, and put simply, it was ripe for reform. But then we also see that there's public support. So clean slate is one of the many different policies that can help fix the issues historically facing Oklahoma. And if you look at recent polling, supermajorities of Republicans as well as Democrats have shown, or at least seemed as though they show that they were at least sympathetic to clean slate, if not very supportive. And meanwhile, you had advocates on the ground, coalitions on the ground, working hard to educate lawmakers. So again, we've got a policy need, and we've got public support for addressing that need. Then we have political will. Representative Nicole Miller was a strong champion, introduced the bill. She was a fantastic lawmaker to have on board. And then you have political muscle because the governor's office was on board too. So combined, you have a recipe for wild success. And in fact, the bill passed nearly unanimously out of both chambers before the governor signed it into law. So what we have here is a blueprint for other states to follow. And if they can, then in reality, the sky is the limit.
Yeah, well, I think that's very indicative. Obviously, having the governor on board and a strong champion in the legislature is really a good way to get things moving. And that's why I think oftentimes, voters are so important, and particularly at the state level, because so many policies are so much focus on and oxygen taken out of the room with federal government affairs and things that are going on in Washington. Anthony, not to slight what's going on in Washington at all, but so many policies, like Anthony mentioned, the state legislatures do pass far more bills every year than Congress could ever hope to, with exception of the post office namings and other sort of small things like you mentioned. And those are the policies that really at a state level, particularly in the criminal justice system, an overwhelming vast majority of folks who are incarcerated at the state and local level. They are not, in fact, held in federal systems or charged or convicted of federal crimes. And so reforming these state-based systems is really, really important. And so voters can obviously play a huge role in that by choosing who their governor is and choosing who their state representatives are, and understanding that they may have even a larger influence on kind of their day-to-day life and the systems around them than even federal elections do, which often get the most media attention. So just something to keep in mind for everyone out in the states that, if you're worried about what's going on in the federal level, definitely be worried about that, but also focus in on the state and local level, because so much important policy making is done there, as was made by design in our country. And that's by intentionality and not a mistake. So we can take advantage of that. And thanks to folks like Robert and Mark, our street is able to kind of engage in those processes. Anthony, to go back to the federal level and talk a bit about the economic case for Clean Slate. As I mentioned, you recently co-authored a wonderful piece with Nick Thielman on Clean Slate related to the economic benefits of the policy. Can you walk our audience through what those benefits are? We've already touched on some of them, but anything you want to expand upon? And also share with us how impactful are those points when you're discussing Clean Slate with congressional offices as opposed to other arguments?
Yeah, no, definitely. And, just to highlight one thing from my perspective on what my colleagues on the state government affairs team just added on is, as Sarah said, a lot of times, it does go hand in hand. And, when policy is created responsibly and on the state level, it makes my job a lot easier to push it on the federal level. If when we look at bills and sometimes they are criminal justice related in my portfolio and sometimes they're not. But when, you either go far to the left or far to the right in a state and, you don't bring the proper, broad coalition together to work on things. You don't think things through from other stakeholder perspectives and factor that into legislation. Like what they did in Pennsylvania for Clean Slate. If you go that route of only wanting to go with your side of the aisle and not the other, then a lot of times it makes it hard for me to market that as, things and power fluctuate, in Congress and especially also in the White House, as we've seen in the past 12 years. And so, those are always key. I would say that to stakes, state, advocates and stakeholders is that, it benefits everyone if we all work together instead of just going with the people we're only comfortable working with. And so that's my take on that. But yeah, me and my colleague co-wrote a piece earlier this year, kind of highlighting economic benefits of this specific policy. And a lot of it, we wrote this piece as, we had very kind of uncertain economic times, in that moment. And as, I said earlier, of trying to meet the moment. And, a lot of people in the research that we highlighted in a lot of the research that we've put out previously at R Street, how, if the folks that are eligible for a clean slate, around the country, if we were to properly implement this on a federal and also state level in other states, aside from the 12 that are already have passed it, but also the 12 have not implemented it yet, we would see up to, 80 some $billion in GDP growth, through that. And, a lot of times, and that number comes from, as I said, from other numbers I highlighted earlier, if the 60% that are unemployed, year one, if a good amount of them are able to find, employment in year one, that benefits the economy. The 27% that are still unemployed after year one, if a good amount of them, find a job, that helps the economy. If the 40% who are, for lack of a better term, underemployed, and making less than their counterparts without a criminal record are, properly compensated, or even making more because, they're able to access higher, positions on their career ladder, that benefits the economy. And so, I think that we try to kind of bring a lot of those arguments together, in previous things that we've highlighted and show, federal lawmakers, the true economic benefit of getting people into work. Because when people have a job, when people have security, they're not, resorting to, survival crime, what we're seeing with some of these, thefts in stores or, going back to, more other illicit activities. And so, all of those, kind of bringing all of those together to show the positive economic impacts of, clean slate. And a lot of times we've seen these in some of the states. I think probably Pennsylvania is the more, um, the better one to look at just because they've had it for so long. And so, um, you know, as I said earlier, framing it in that way so that as lawmakers are talking about the economy, this is an economic issue, and we should be able to get in on that conversation and not just silo ourselves and only be in a criminal justice issue.
I did it again. That's great, Anthony. And I want to go to Mark to expand on that a little bit. Obviously, the economic issue is a major one, and it does fit in with, it does help Clean Slate fit in with how we talk about limited effective government and free market solutions and really empowering the public and private businesses and private individuals to really support a successful economy as opposed to turning to for various programs and solutions to society's problems. Mark, you spent a lot of time in the right of center policy world, both outside and inside of government. You're quite tuned in with policy landscapes on issues outside of the criminal justice work as well. And so I want to ask you how you see Clean Slate fitting in addition to the economic benefits, as a part of the broader conversation and the need for limited and effective government and free market solutions, in a way that folks on the right of center have long been advocating for, as opposed to a big government solution.
Sure. I mean, when it comes to criminal justice reforms and clean slate more generally, I mean, there's a host of great reasons to support them. And we all know them. It reduces recidivism. It relieves pressure on the justice system, leading to financial and opportunity cost savings. And people are able to cobble their lives back together, get a better education, get a better job, better housing, and so forth. But to your question of how does this fit in the broader theme of limiting the size and scope of government and solving societal problems, I mean, for me, that's easy. There are few bigger government programs that leave lasting impacts on Americans than the justice system. And having to carry a permanent record after being rehabilitated is a lasting and very heavy penalty. And Clean Slate reduces that big government imposed burden. But there are broader benefits associated with Clean Slate. I mean, we're constantly grappling with some issues that Anthony mentioned, workforce shortages, underemployment, and the cost of providing taxpayer funded assistance to the needy. Clean Slate can help get people back on their feet and address these societal issues. So ultimately, Clean Slate is far more than a criminal justice reform. It's also an economic reform.
That's great. I don't think there's a better way to put that. So thank you very much, Mark. In our last, I guess, 8.5 minutes here, I just want to close with a rapid fire round for all three of our panelists. And the question is this: if there's one piece of advice or a talking point that you could give advocates or even other sort of government affairs folks out in other outside groups, whether they're state-based groups or federal and more nationally based nonprofits, when they are talking to state or federal legislators about Clean Slate, what would that piece of advice or talking point be?
I would say my advice is for Clean Slate advocates is that engage with every lawmaker that you really can, that serves on a judicial committee, courts committee, public safety committee, whatever the relevant committees are in the state legislature. And you never know who could be a potential champion of it. And you really, the worst thing you're going to hear from anyone is no. So I think that that's an important thing. It's not like, there's nothing to be afraid of besides someone just saying no, which isn't that bad at the end of the day. Moreover, I always advise framing your arguments based on what that lawmaker is interested in, on a personal level. For example, if you're going to speak to someone that's like a fiscal hawk, you want to talk about the savings of the policy, or if you're talking to someone about, I don't know, that backs the blue, talk about how this is going to take more. This is going to ensure that cops don't have to spend as much time on recidivism cases because you'll have a decline in that. So I think that really you want to play up the angles that are most important with the individual you're speaking to.
Yeah, I think if I were to give a pithy talking point for people to borrow, to steal, to use, whatever you want to say, to use with lawmakers, I would say it's penalties for minor crimes should not be a life sentence. When people have demonstrated themselves to be rehabilitated, let's get the government out of the way and let these people thrive.
Wow, that was true lightning round fashion, Mark. I think for me, my advice to advocates is always, listen first. I know a lot of times you're well versed on the issue. A lot of times you've been impacted by the issue, but as the saying goes, we've been given two ears and one mouth, so we should listen twice the amount that we speak. And so, I've always said that, and then you kind of execute what Robert said earlier, speak to the issues that matter most to the person you're talking to. And another, talking point I always like to, reemphasize is grounding the issue that 1 in 3 Americans have a criminal record. When you're in a room of, 6 people, on average, 2 of you could have a criminal record. It goes to show to the lawmaker that this is an issue that only affects a small amount of people. This is an issue that affects 1/3 of the populace of this country and their districts. And so, those are always key to emphasize.
Great. Well, thanks to all three of you for those insights. And Mark, yes, congratulations on if I had to choose a winner, for winning the lightning round just by virtue of how fast it was. And also it was great. So not to slight Anthony or Robert's comments, because I think they're equally impactful, but Mark follows directions today. So I love that. Seeing we have about 5 minutes left, I am inclined to give the 5 minutes back to folks on their calendars. But I really appreciate everybody joining today and tuning in to this webinar. We had one a couple of months ago focused on the kind of practitioner side of Clean Slate. And at that time, we thought it was really important to bring on our government affairs experts to, again, talk about how this actually plays out in legislative advocacy, what some of the challenges are in legislatures that folks might not think about on the ground or in research, and how to really consider those as one big equation toward ultimately passing these types of policies. So thank you so much to everybody for tuning in. And thank you as well to Mark and Anthony and Robert for providing their expertise here. I think it's really important to not only bring our scholars on webinars to talk about policies, but also our in-house government affairs experts. And I do see a question in the question and answer. Will we get a copy of the recording of this Zoom? The answer is yes. Our wonderful communications team will be taking this recording, uploading it to YouTube, uploading it to our website, and then it will get distributed to everybody on this webinar today. So thank you for the question, and thank you again, everyone, for tuning in, and thanks to our wonderful panelists. Have a great day.